Today's podcast is brought to you by I Have a CPA Guy. And my name is Martin Gutierrez. I'm the Director of Government Affairs, and I am sitting in for our CEO, Gilbert Gonzalez, to host this podcast. So joining us today is Mr. Robert Garcia with I Have a CPA Guy. So without further ado, let's begin. Tell us about yourself, Robert, how you got here, a little bit about you and your involvement in the community and the story behind I Have a CPA Guy.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having us. I really appreciate being here talking about a topic that I don't think gets enough coverage. I know people care about it, especially right now, right? I got some people yelling at me right now. So we do care, but we also have to make sure we're educating people. So, we got started 11 and a half years ago. Basically, I was working full time, kind of wanted to do my own thing, but I got some advice from a friend that said, hey, before you quit, make sure that you have, your book of business set up, right? And so just kind of work it side by side. So I did that for eight years, right? Working side by side with corporate America. And then in the middle of the pandemic, I just kind of got a bit frustrated, realized I had started taking some leadership classes, right? So it was like Strength Finders, Crucial Conversations, Emotional Intelligence. And I just started realizing I'm not in the right place. The struggles that I had really weren't struggles that, they were a little bit more me. And so we had saved up a little bit of money, and, I talked to Lily, who's my wife, and I said, hey, dude, what would you think if we just quit and did this? They invested in ourselves, and that was the biggest thing. It was like, I wanted to invest in ourselves. So if we failed, at least I can say I tried, and so we had a little bit of money saved up, right, to, eat on ramen. And, for those out there, we have a family of 5, right? So we have 3 kids. So it definitely was a big risk, especially at 39 years old, right? And this was also in the middle of the pandemic, which everybody thought I was absolutely nuts and insane. Look at me now, right? That's what I say. But, overall, I mean, these last 4 years have been tremendous success. So what we do, right, is that we're community people in advocacy, right? That's what the CPA stands for. And so we really do try to make sure that we lean in, right, to our clients and our community and overall for our business community.
Awesome. So you got a lot of energy. Why accounting? What got you into this?
Yeah, I always get that, right? There, people without knowing that I'm a CPA, they're just like, I wouldn't have expected you, right? I think comments like, Bill Stein or whatnot, you know what I mean? Just the glasses, the pocket protector, that kind of deal, right? Very code-ish. I don't know. I actually wanted to be an attorney. I went to St. Mary's, and I was like, hey, I'm going to go to law school. I thought I could do well in law school, and so I went to St. Mary's. And I get there, I'm like, hey, I want to go to law school. Like, how do I get in? They're like, well, you need a degree. I was like, right, that's why I'm here. So I can get a law degree, and they're like, no, you need a degree before you come to law school. Mind blown. I was like, man, I got to work like twice as hard to get in here. But one of the best pieces of advice I'd ever been given in my entire life was when I was walking away, the lady stopped me and she goes, if I can give you a piece of advice, she says, a lot of people come through these doors wanting to go to law school, and they rush their undergrad to get here, and they end up finding out law school is not for them. Then they don't have, or they drop out, right? Or she goes, and what ends up happening is that they don't have anything to fall back on of what they really wanted to do. And I was taking an accounting class, and it really was sort of, kicking my butt, but I was like, accounting, tax law, corner office, corporate America, New York, here I come. And so that's what I did, right? So I was like, well, let me go. And then I had some really good, I started at Northwest Visa. So shout out to the Alamo Community Colleges, right? I'm a product. Got to UTSA, and I had some friends that invested in me. They're like, hey, why not stay in public accounting? I'm like, I have no idea what that is. And they're like, no, it's Big Four. It's the same thing as a law firm. It takes 15 years to get a partner. You can make $500,000. Like, it's the prestige of CPAs. So I weighed my options, and I was like, okay. And then I got, some internships at some Big Four, public accounting firms, right, in the world. And I just stayed. Now it's on my bucket list, though. I mean, I'm getting older, but it's on my bucket list to maybe go back. We got some good friends, right, that have gone back. So
funny enough, makes 2 of us. I thought I wanted to go to law school for
a
while.
We'll go together.
And decided policy school was better. So it's a common story I hear amongst people.
It's good to share, right? So people understand, like, hey, you can pivot and adjust and, do different things. Like, it's not, was it singular, like straight, right? You know what I mean? Like, it's just not. And I think a lot of times people think like, oh, you knew what you wanted to do. No, folks, we did not know what we wanted to do. And we still don't know what we want to do.
Exactly. Law school will always be there if you decide to go back. So let's talk about your involvement in the community. You're very involved, sit on various boards, commissions, etc. What's going on in the community in San Antonio that small business owners and realtors should be paying attention to outside of taxes?
Yeah, like I said, just right now, I mean, we got involved, the way we got involved was because we were getting a lot of questions around, hey, I need to set up an LLC. How do I do this? Whatever. And I was like, man, that's a lot of just informational, right? Like somebody's got to be solving this for them. And so I didn't want to criticize the system, right? So I just went out and started looking and researching and meeting people. And I had already been doing that on my Facebook. So I was a little strategic, right? So if tips out there, social media's changed a little bit, but I didn't care to meet people on LinkedIn. Why? Because people on LinkedIn typically are going to show you their best version of themselves. So I would go to Facebook, and if you would let me friend you on Facebook, I could see the window in who you were, right? And so we started to just find out what BDOs were out there, what the chambers did, right? Getting involved in the committees, leadership programs, those kinds of things. And through that, we just, we showed up and we did the work, right? We're probably the most visible CPA out there, right? In San Antonio. And I would even venture to say a little bit in the state, right? As we're starting to work towards the state, even on the federal level, as we've gone to SADC the last 3 years. For me, I think that some of the things to think about where we are, right, in terms of the small business. So we have Supply SA, right, with our certifications for small businesses, which, is things that we have to think about. The missions downtown, right, in terms of, small business and real estate. So the missions stadium moving downtown, right, sort of being approved, breaking ground. And now we have the conversation of Project Marvel, right? And what does that look like for those commercial, residential communities, right? And whether there's displacement or opportunities for investment, all of those things are real opportunities for our city. And those are things that I think people need to understand, learn, get behind, right? So I don't pretend to know everything, but I do try to be as informed as I can.
Awesome. Yeah, Robert is very involved with the community. You will see him everywhere and anywhere.
Yeah.
So let's talk about small business, right? So when most people think of realtors, they do not think they are small business owners. And I think that's a conversation that's been had actually at the council level, looking back at some of the decisions made. But 15,000 members in Bexar County and the surrounding counties. We go all the way down now to Beeville and out to Uvalde. Are realtors small businesses, and what does that impact say to you based on those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great membership. 15,000 is incredible. And shout out to Uvalde, right? It's my hometown. It's a weird one, right? Because I don't think that people realize when they transition from, corporate job, or even like, so my wife, was stay-at-home mom for a while, right? And so this was kind of her next step into working with us, right, in our firm. It's a weird feeling, like you're going out there, you're interacting with clients, and you're really trying to deliver a service. But are you a small business? You are, right? And I don't think that that's very clear when you're getting your licensing and having those conversations, right? Those kinds of things, because it's just not the sexy topic, right? People don't really want to deal with the back office administrative stuff, but it's a reality, right? We have to make sure we are organized in our receipts. We got to make sure that we're keeping up, right, with our deductions, right? We have to make sure we're keeping up with our licensing and a number of other back office administrative stuff, right? That's the work that we do, right, on the accounting side, on the tax side. And so I think like there is best practices, right, that we should think about when it comes to that. But I think all realtors need to realize you are running a small business because you might be contracting with vendors, right? Your photographers, right? Your landscapers. There's a number of things, right, that realtors do outside of just simply negotiating a good deal on the house, right? And then giving somebody their future home.
Awesome. So let's talk about that. You made a key point there, organization. What are some good record-keeping practices for realtors to stay organized?
Well, this one's tough, so I'm going to be real, right? When it comes to, certain professions, right, keeping track is always a hard one, right? And so there's a number of apps and tools out there that people can use, but also it's also personal behavior. You've got to want to, figure out what this looks like for you. So it can give you some best practices, but you also just have to figure out like, hey, if you're a mom and you're dealing with kids in the morning and taking them to school, like maybe the mornings aren't the best time for you to put things together, right? Maybe it's the end of the weekend or whatnot. So you have to kind of figure out your own sort of timing blocks on some of that. The biggest thing I would say is that start your own bank account, right? So oftentimes people mix it into their personal account, right? So commissions go in there, expenses go in there, they're using their credit card, other things, but now you're using the tools that you have or the financial institutions across multiple platforms. So trying to gather all that at the end of the year is always a challenge, right? So you can either, get your own bank account, right? It has to be a personal one since you are a small business, and we'll talk about that in a second of what that looks like to transition. But so you can get another personal account, and that'll be the account that you deposit your commissions, and then that you basically use to pay for everything. And or get a second card, right? An additional card, credit card, if you need to leverage, right? Some of that credit line. Then that whole card, both of them then become dedicated. And then you can easily download those and give them to your CPA, right, to do the work. There's also apps out there too, right? I won't name too many because they're not sponsoring this for us, right? But there are some apps out there, right, in terms of making sure that we have, things to keep track of, right? Your expenses to keep track of. A good accounting software at times too. There's a couple like $10 a month, right, to sort of do your own accounting that you can attach it to the bank account and stuff. It's all just really good record keeping. People want to shy away from that because I just don't care, right? Just tell me what I owe or whatever the case is. But you really want to understand how much you're paying for, right, the photographer and those kinds of things, because at the end of the day, we're chasing the deal and we don't always know like what the margin, the profitability from that deal is based on the number of hours that you spent and the cost that you've spent and everything else. So that information is really good to kind of have if you want to sort of elevate your game a little bit.
So you mentioned a lot about technology.
Yeah.
Any insights on what AI can do for organization?
Oh man, no.
Or help now in the accounting world?
This is a curveball that my good friend Martin's throwing at me here. I think people need to just get informed. I was at a Lyceum conference down in Austin at the beginning of this year that was their PubCon AI, and it was incredible. There's a lot of fear and a lot of misinformation out there, but it's just incredible of the type of information that it can predict for you, right? That really does allow you to see. So in terms of like the market, right? Like what does that look like? Today, we are just using averages, right? Of like how many houses are sold. And typically last year, this time, here we're starting to look at behaviors. And I think I don't have any specifics, but I would tell people is they don't shy away from it. Don't be scared. Identify some opportunities there. And again, if SABOR has opportunities, right, that you can share and some tools or, things like that, or, I think that would be helpful, right, for for realtors out there. I think just leveraging that a little bit better will probably give you an advantage.
Are your business finances stressing you out? Meet I Have a CPA Guy, a trusted family-owned firm that takes the headache out of bookkeeping, taxes, and financial planning. Whether you're a small business owner or just need expert tax advice, Robert Garcia and his team provide personalized, no-nonsense guidance to keep your finances on track. They believe in building relationships, educating clients, and making sure you walk away with a clear understanding of your financial picture. Ready to take control of your numbers? Visit IHaveACPAGuy.com to learn more.
What are some other common deductions and not so common deductions that realtors should be aware of?
I had to bring my list because, we deal with a lot of small businesses. And I think a lot of times people do feel like we'll field calls, right? And they're like, hey, do you have experience in real estate, right? And it's like, yes and no. Like, are you a developer, or do you sell 5 houses a year? And you can sell 50 houses a year. But my point to that is that it's not as complicated as people want to feel, and you don't necessarily need industry specific, right, sort of knowledge around it. Common deductions, right? I think that, most are like your MLS fees, right? If the broker's charging you something, your license fees, insurance, advertising, if you're paying vendors, right, to do the landscaping and photography, all of those are deductible. Biggest one is going to be your mileage, right? So, probably won't get into this right now, but is my car, in my business? There's other issues to think about there, but mileage is going to be the biggest one. So I go back to, using an app, and you can Google real quick, which mile apps, there are to track it, but that's usually going to be the biggest one. CPA services, i.e. like your CPA guy, right? So, definitely know, right, that you can deduct us. And then client gifts and things like that as well too, right? So there's a laundry list of things. What I tell people is like, most of the time people will spend the money to make the money. And so you're not really missing anything most of the time, right? So just kind of be comforted that if you're spending it, all of that's typically a deduction, minus maybe like Spurs tickets and things that have been now sort of scratched from the entertainment.
Gotcha. So I think that kind of goes back to the idea of being organized and keeping track of all these expenses throughout the year, so you thoroughly have everything in one spot when it comes that time to get ready for filing again. Yeah.
So to address the uncommon questions, right? So it's preparation, right? And so like we don't know what we don't know, and so we can be experts all day long, but if you fail to give us something, or we maybe didn't ask enough questions around things as we're engaging, right? So we'll look at you in any client sort of intake. Tell me what you do right here. And so we start to look at your information. So if your information kind of has holes, then it's a little harder for us to kind of tell you what else, you should be looking at, or maybe what you might be missing. Some of the uncommon ones, right, that in our intake form, I mean, we always touch on these. These are pretty common for us, but obviously for others, they're not. So like a home office, right? So, hey, now you're a business. So you do, if you have a dedicated space in your home, you can take that. Rebates. And so what I mean by that is sometimes you'll either give a discount to the client, right, of your commission, right? And so you can actually, if you're getting paid that or it's issued on the 1099 from the broker and you've paid the client or returned those monies back, right, that's something you can deduct. Also, this is always a bit, I don't want to say controversial, but it just comes from the TikTok world, which is the paying your kids, right? So, if your kids are of age and there are certain other requirements that you have to have, you can assign work to them, right? Some of the administrative work, advertising work, those kinds of things to then pay your kids as well too. So those are some of the uncommon ones, and they don't apply to everybody, right? And the kids thing for me is always like, do you have the extra cash to give the kids, right? I think in this profession, you're probably in a good position to be able to utilize that advantage.
So we talked about a lot on the realtor side. Let's talk about the consumer side, right, as well. What should people who are on the market buying or selling a home be considering during tax season? There's a lot of talk right now, right? Questions, except people I'm sure ask you all the time, hey, I'm looking to sell, buy a home. What should I be thinking when it comes to taxes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very subjective because, in the tax world right now, when TCJA back in 2017, when they passed it, they increased the standard deduction, which did, in fact, it helped because it gave us a larger deduction, right? Took the exemptions away. But, where I think it didn't help was that typically a middle-class family would, deduct their property taxes, their mortgage interest, especially if they're at the beginning part of the loans. And you also would have contributions and things like that, right? Which enabled you to I'm going to start contributing a little bit more because then that puts me right above sort of the exemption mark. I think looking at things like property taxes is always going to be really important, right? That's not necessarily on the tax preparation side, but just kind of knowing, right, where you are, right, and what brackets, what that looks like for your, and I know realtors going to share that, but the interest side as well too, right? And I think as a realtor, as a small business owner, I think if you're buying a home from that perspective, right, you have to understand sort of the cash flow and the impact that it's going to have on your business. Oftentimes people will go, well, we're small business owners. Well, yes, but you're also a sole proprietor, right? And so we have to talk about your family and the day-to-day expenses and all of those things, because otherwise you will over leverage your business to try to do things. And then you put yourself in a not so good spot, right? So there's a few things like that, right, that I would say at this point to kind of consider. And in particular, if you are buying sort of that larger home, right, kind of the 750 and above, what does that look like for your home overall for your taxes, right? If you're able to get past that, I think it's like $27,000, $29,000 this year. So if you don't have, your mortgage interest, your property taxes, state and local income tax, donations above that $29,000, then it's not gonna help you on the taxes.
Yeah. So anything on follow up on capital gains or anything in the state of Texas buying and selling a home that are exemptions, deductions on the consumer side?
There's a lot, right? I think there's always a lot of information, right? And so this is kind of that, how much time do you spend on each industry, right? To make sure that you're addressing. Any good CPA is going to research and kind of know, no matter what, right? And there's probably not too many things that, we're not as familiar with. I think the biggest question that I get is, hey, I just sold a home. How much am I going to pay, right? And we're like, well, how much did you sell it for? So there's what's called the home exclusion. And so if you're single, married filing, single, head of household, it's up to $250,000, right? So $250,000 is excluded. If you're married filing joints, up to $500,000. What happens is, and I don't know where the conversations are or not happening, but what happens is that people were like, especially now, right? We bought a home, like our example is like we bought a home way back then at the top end of what we could afford, right? And it was 2 something. Homes in my neighborhood are selling for 5. Right. So people see the 5, right, and go, well, I just sold my home for 5. How much am I going to pay? And I think that's the part that we just need a little bit more clarity on. Just because you sold a home for $500,000 or $600,000 doesn't mean that you're paying taxes on that. What it is that what did you buy the home for originally? That's called the basis, right? So you might have bought it at $250,000 and you're selling it at $600,000. It's only a $350,000 gain. So you're within the exclusion, so you won't have to pay any taxes on it, assuming married filing joint.
Awesome. That's all good information. So What are some things that realtors should look for when choosing a CPA?
Me. We're pretty phenomenal when it comes to our services. I had the privilege of helping Martin's dad this weekend. And I was told him, he's just like, hey, because we're virtual and, we've invested a lot into our technology and our workflows to make it as simple, but yet we still know digital divide and all of those things. But we were hopeful that it was a very easy process.
Very easy.
Aside from the easy, we want it to be, right? We want it to be click, 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 and want to make sure we're educating people, but it's also important for the touch points, right? So when you talk about like, what should you look for in a CPA on any good CPA, and there's some bad ones out there. Don't get me wrong. There's some that I'm just like, whoa, right? But they're good test takers. They took it, they passed the test, right? As many people with any licenses can do. But, so the technical side, I'm not as concerned with. I would tell you it's really more on the approach, right? And the communication. Number one reason we get calls right now is because of lack of communication. I can't get a hold of, right? I'm sending emails, I'm sending this. A lot of times as solar practitioners, and even, we have like 3 employees, right? Total, right? That's our size. But that's why we invested so heavily into our technology and those touch points, right? To create a customer experience that, for me, I like to just say, I'm trying to get to Disney level, right? Like they're squeegeeing, trash cans and things like that because after rain, right? Because like things that you'll never notice unless somebody points it out because they're that good, right? So that customer experience really does help people. Taxes give people anxiety. Every year, if you're not ready, you're like, just tell me how much I owe, right? And they're just like, and it's hurtful and you're like, So educating them in that, what it might look like and giving them a little run room for next year. Hey, have you made X dollars again? This is probably where you're going to be. So communication, right, is probably going to be the number one thing. And then just making sure that they have good systems. A lot of times, they're operating on email or, Excel files and things like that. And it gets difficult for all of us during this time, right? We're getting bombarded with a number of clients, the number of issues, new, right? Some leaving, et cetera. So those 2 things I think really do help support, right? From a more personal place, because it is a compliance and, it's just not a friendly place. We've just not made it friendly. We make it friendly, but it's just not friendly overall, right? It's always creates anxiety. So communication.
Yeah, that's key. I think communication, customer experience is what people do look for because taxes aren't sexy, but there's something you do have to do every year.
Every year.
Death and taxes are the only 2 things
Let's not do death every year. Let's not do death every year, but yes.
All right. Well, this before we conclude our podcast for today, I'd like to, give a little teaser to part 2. We'll be bringing Robert back in the fall to talk about preparation, which sounds far away, but that's a few months away with the summer and everything going on this year. I think you'll be back here shortly. Can you talk about what you're going to elaborate more on or kind of topics you want to talk about in part 2 of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is like I'm going to toss this out to the crowd, right? We're here to serve, right? We're a servant leader, so want the crowd to turn around and go, hey, it's a great podcast, right? Learned a lot of information. Here's a list of topics that we can sort of distill. My biggest thing in everything that I do is about preparation, right? We have to make sure we're prepared. We have all the things ready to go. And that's the biggest thing for business owners, right? Within our systems and the work that we do is that's what we're trying to make sure is that they have some consistency and organization. And the best way we can, again, they're people. We can't control what they do and force them to do the things that we need them to do. So things like what does paying 1099s, issuing 1099s looks like, right? So you work with vendors. People don't realize you got to issue them a 1099 if you paid over $600. Some of that has been in the courts and changes to some of the bills that have come out. So we might be looking at something different if this administration chooses to increase that 600 to 1,000, right? Which was kind of kicked around last year, last couple of years, right? Same thing with like Zelle, Cash App, right? In terms of whose responsibility is it? So things like that, right? The 1099s, and just now also looking at organization, right? What does the organization look like? I think one thing that we didn't touch on right now was, just the estimated tax payments. How do they pay? And so making sure, right, that like, well, how do you pay? Well, if you're self-employed, you have to pay. Nobody's withholding for you. So you want to make, 4 quarterly estimates. And sometimes that's in collaboration with the CPA. Sometimes that's owed, $1,000. So it's $250 a quarter, right? And if it moves higher, lower, you can kind of adjust that, but that's going to be things that we want to start talking about right at the end of the year to just make sure people have better preparation going into the year, gathering up all their documents and those kinds of things. So there's probably a few more things in there, right, that probably not thinking off the top of my head, but I'd love to hear from the audience and see what the audience feels. I mean, you have 15,000 members. I'd love to see a long list of, this is what I'd like to a little bit more, and, see where we can continue to help support.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us, Robert. You heard it here. If you have any suggestions for the upcoming podcast, please email communications@sabor.com so that way we can get those topics to Robert with plenty of time and he can elaborate those. But again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the podcast. And today's podcast was brought to you by I Have a CPA Guy, Robert.
Yeah, go follow us.
Social media.
I Have a CPA Guy on Instagram. We're on TikTok and Facebook. Yeah, I would love to, throw a follow. We're always going to share information and the things that we do, and love to bring people on there, so yeah.
And you will always see him in brand, in
always.
any shirt, everything.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you so much for having me.